I think we'll get going. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to this program of the Hadley Historical Society. My name's Alan Weinberg. I'm the current president of the society, and we are a nonprofit private institution located down the street at 12 Middle Street, and we collect, preserve, and present Hadley's history. We have open houses third Sunday of the month during the spring, summer, and fall, and we present programs like this one from time to time on Hadley's history. Oops, that's not the slideshow, that's my grandkids. We'll try that again. Okay. These are some of our sponsors for our programs: Mass Cultural Council, Hadley Cultural Council, Divine Overhead Doors, Bermucci in 2025. And I'd also like to acknowledge the other organizations and museums that we work with and have helped us and are sources of information for us. And I'll mention a few of them: the Porter Phelps Huntington Museum, which is also in Hadley; Historic Deerfield, was Historic Northampton; the Daughters of American Revolution, they have a chapter in Northampton. I think I see a member in our audience, too. They're great. And of course, the Hadley Community Preservation Committee, which has helped fund our restoration and preservation efforts over the years. And we have a couple more that we're going to be proposing for this year. So what I'm going to cover today, Hadley and the Revolution. We're going to talk about the run-up to the Revolution in Hadley and in Massachusetts. The town of Hadley during the Revolution, we'll spend a little time on that. The Revolutionary War service of the Hadley men, and the work that the townsfolk and the women did to support the Revolution as well. We'll talk a little bit about the weapons and equipment of the soldiers. We'll talk about Josiah Pierce, his diary, and his son's diary. The March to Quebec and the lost diary of William Pierce, Josiah's son. Colonel Elisha Porter, who was the highest ranking soldier in the town and Big Mucky Muck here, and his service with Washington, Benedict Arnold, and Burgoyne, the British general. And what happened to Burgoyne's sword, which is which is a question we always get: what happened to Burgoyne's sword? And I'd like to acknowledge some of the sources of information. This is Josiah Pierce's diary and his spectacles. He was the town clerk in Hadley before, during, and after the Revolution. He's had 3 sons who served. The information in that diary forms the basis for a lot of the information that we'll be talking about today. This is Elizabeth Porter Phelps of the Porter Phelps Museum. She kept a diary from about 1865 to the 1765 till the early 1800s. There's a lot of information about what it was like during the Revolution in Hadley. That's her diary. That diary is in the special collections at UMass. Josiah's diary we have. And the other main source of information is the Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors during the Revolutionary War. Was compiled from war records in, I think, 1906, around that, and published. And all the service records of the Revolutionary War soldiers, not just Massachusetts, but all the colonies, can be found in those volumes. Very good source of information. Let me go back. And one other source that I have to mention, 2 other sources, is a blog that a local historian named Sherman Loans, who's here with us today, who has studied extensively about Burgoyne and the Convention Army after the Battle of Saratoga and the defeat of Burgoyne's soldiers, they were marched supposedly to Boston, supposedly through Hadley. And Sherman has done a lot of research on what actually happened, and we'll be talking a little bit about that later. I just want to acknowledge his work. And another gentleman who's not here today, Richard Colton, who was the retired historian for the National Park Service, Springfield Armory, who's helped us with our musket collection. But we brought one today. We have several of the Revolution and the Civil War, and he's helped us document and the history of those weapons. Yeah. This is the Honor Roll Revolutionary War plaque that's located on the 3rd floor of the Goodwin building next door. Okay? There are 4 plaques, one for the original settlers of the town, one for the Revolutionary War veterans, one for the Civil War veterans, and one for World War I. That's as far as it goes. They put that collection of honor roll, veterans honor rolls in the building in 1920, and that was obviously right after World War I. World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, there's no memorial in that building. There is one in the VFW, a very nice one in the VFW building if you're interested, but that's the official town, if you will, memorial. It only goes as far as World War I. So let me talk a little bit about Hadley in 1775 during the Revolution. This is the map of West Street, which is the main street in town at the time. It was where the town center was at the time. This shows the house lots, the river on the north and the river on the south. Hadley's in between them. If you've ever seen the West Street Common, it's one of the nicest commons in New England. And it hasn't changed much since then. This is what it looks like today. And you can see the long common, it stretches. This is the dike at the bottom of that slide, all the way, can't quite see at the other end. The river did flow close to the end of the street in 1775. It has since moved away, and now we have the Aquavita Meadows, which is quite an extensive area of farmland and woods. But in 1775, that river was within a couple hundred feet of the south end of West Street. And there were ferries on both ends. There were 3 or 4 ferries in town. There were 3 or 4 taverns. And actually, this house here on the south end of West Street existed back then as a ferry house and a tavern. And there are probably 13 or so houses that still exist in Hadley that date back from the 1775. I think I have pictures of, yeah, this is one of them. This is the Kellogg house, which actually stood where the Goodwin Library is now. That was taken down in 1902 for the library, but that was here during the Revolution. This is the Porter House on West Street, the oldest house in town, 1713. That's still there. Although you can see the porches, those are the old style porches. They added some porches in the 19th century. This is in Hockanum. I believe it's the Lyman House. Is that right, Denise? Yeah. That's one of the oldest houses in town. And I think they moved that. That's the house they moved, I believe. No, a different one. Yeah, they moved the Barstow House. Yeah. Okay, but anyway, that's in Hockanum. So this is to give you an idea what the houses look like. They were not shacks. Okay, Hadley was a wealthy town, and comparatively speaking, it was not Boston, but it was well off. And this is the kitchen of the Porter Phelps house, and you can see the musket over the mantle. You can see the big spinning wheel. We'll talk a bit about spinning and weaving in a little bit. Let me talk about what was going on in Hadley in 1774 and before the Revolution. As I'm sure you must know, or many of you know, Hadley is no friend of the monarchy or the king, even before there was trouble with the British Parliament. I mean, we had the regicides who chopped off King Charles I's head in the 17th century. After the monarchy was restored, they fled England and they were hidden here by John Russell, the minister, and others in town. Strict Puritans, didn't care for the king or the British religion, which was Protestant, but not Protestant enough for the Puritans. So they had no love for England from day one of the colony. And that carried right through the revolutionary times. When Boston got into trouble with the Parliament because of the Tea Party and other acts in response to the restrictive acts that Britain was imposing and taxes that they were imposing to pay for the French and Indian War, which preceded the Revolution by 20 or 30 years. The Massachusetts folks, the townspeople and the merchants, none of them cared for any of that. They fought tooth and nail, physically as well as through letters and petitions. And the coercive acts was the final straw for people out here. That there were a number of acts that restricted what you could do, and the coercive acts really prevented, or were supposed to prevent us from, the colonists in the New World, from using anything but British goods, and that they wanted to, the British government wanted to impose these restrictions to pay for their wars and the empire. And obviously that didn't go down well, especially in Massachusetts. We were the forefront of the revolution. And in 1774, this is 1775, this proclamation from John Hancock. But before that, Massachusetts passed what's called the Covenant, and it was basically it was instructing the population to boycott British goods, make your own stuff, and that would hurt Britain's economy, and that covenant was adopted by many towns, including Hadley, in different times. Also in 1774, the town of Hadley, as well as other towns, began to make preparations for trouble. They gathered gunpowder and weapons, and they started training the militia intensely. They always had a militia, but they really started upping that. They passed resolutions instructing the colonial Congress to petition the king to back off a bit. They formed the committees of correspondence, which met to plan the resistance. And Josiah Pierce, a town clerk, was a representative of Hadley. In Hadley, and let me mention that in 1775, John Hancock issued a proclamation from the provincial Congress, basically instructing all the towns, get ready. This was the beginning of 75. Get ready, train your militias, stockpile your weapons, trouble's coming. Now, there were loyalists in all the colonies, of course, the Tories, and the rebellious people were called patriots. And in the valley, there were some division between the patriots and the loyalists. Not in Hadley too much. Hadley was pretty much a revolutionary town. In Hatfield, where the Williams family was very powerful, they were very wealthy, and they were loyalists. They were Tories. And their counterpart in Hadley, the Porter family were not loyalists. In fact, Elizabeth Porter was very upset about the things that were going on. Charles Phelps, Elizabeth's husband, was a rich merchant. He was a river god, just like Israel Williams was, but he never spoke out against the revolution, and he did support it. There is a story that, and the Tories were not treated well, to say the least, in towns that supported the revolution. And this is even before the revolution. And there's a story that a mob of Hadley men went over to Hatfield, dragged Israel Williams and his son out of their house, confined them to a cabin to force them to sign the covenant, to agree to boycott British goods. And they refused to do that. So they smoked them out. They smoked them. They covered up the chimney and started a fire. And basically, the story goes, they did sign afterwards. Again, that may be more of a legend than a fact, but it's a good one, good story. Towns erected liberty poles in support of the resistance against Great Britain. And there was a competition of the towns to who could erect the highest liberty pole. And Hadley had the highest for a time, 130 feet. I don't know how, that's what they say. I can't imagine something 130 feet without, being a hazard to everybody, but that's how the story goes. As part of the resistance, there was what was called the homespun movement, which was a movement to encourage people to make your own clothes. Don't buy them from the merchants, make your own. And that, of course, fell mostly to the women in all the towns. And this is a typical, very common sight in everybody's house had a spinning wheel. This is for flax to make linen, and the bigger ones were wool. And Elizabeth Porter Phelps was active in doing this. One of the quotes from her diary is she went to let's see if I can have the exact quote. Yes, 1775. Went down to Thomas Smith's house to get Lydia to show me how to make a pair of breeches for the soldiers. People are sent to find them clothes. That was in her diary in 75. So there was a movement, make clothes for the soldiers. Now this is let me talk a little bit about the clothes for the soldiers. This is a reenactor, a Continental Army reenactor. And that's the uniform everybody thinks of. This is the Continental Army uniform. Not so. Very few soldiers had that uniform, especially at the beginning. This is more like what they looked like. This is what the Hadley militia looked like. This picture and that. And by the way, if that outfit is right over there, that outfit is a reenactor. It's a replica of the uniform used by the militia and the Continental soldiers. It was given to us by Fred Wilder, who's here now. Thank you, Fred. Who was a reenactor back in the bicentennial, the last time we had a big commemoration of the revolution. And this replica was made in exactly the same methods and materials that the revolutionary uniforms would have been made from. And I think I was parading around in the hat that he also wore. I think this might fit me. This is the tricorn. And according to Fred, I learned this, and I should have known this because I was in the military. You put your hat over here if you're shooting left-handed. If you're shooting right-handed, the hat goes this way. That right, Fred? Right. Okay. So it's not always, you're like this maybe when you're walking down the street, but when you're in a fight, you got to get it out of your way. Okay. And the weapons that the soldiers had, this is the most common type of weapon. It's called the brown bess, English, although a lot of the weapons were also French, or were made from different parts. We do have one weapon, one musket over here, we can look at later, with the bayonet. And the other two items that are there for you to look at that were used during the Revolution is this pole, which looks like a pike, but it's called a spittoon. And it was not used in combat. It was used to signal soldiers, like here, gather around, forward, retreat. And the officers and the non-commissioned officers would use this. And this sword, we'll talk a little bit about that particular sword later on. This is actually a French sword, but it's similar to what would have been carried by some of the officers. Well, I have more to say about that a little bit later. Okay, so we talked about Hadley in 1775 and all the rebellious thoughts and actions that were going on. Now I want to talk a little about the war service of the Hadley men. So first of all, when the Hadley men went to war during the Revolution, they were not inexperienced soldiers. The militia in the colonies, and particularly in Western Mass, were very experienced. They've been fighting in the French and Indian Wars in particular, but even before that, with the King Philip's War, it was almost continuous warfare. So men around in Hadley, they knew how to use a weapon. They knew how to act as soldiers. They were good fighters, and they were disciplined. Now, in 1775, the population of Hadley was 681. 185 men from Hadley served during the Revolution at one time or another. Not all at once, and not all for the entire duration. But think about that. It's almost 20% of the population went off to war. Now, the service ranged from a few days to a few years, depending on what was going on. A lot of times what would happen is there'd be an alarm, like Lexington and Concord. There was an alarm. The word would spread, something's going on. The British are out, looking for trouble. We need men. So they would saddle up and go to wherever the trouble was. In the case of Lexington and Concord, there was an alarm. Let's see if right here. This is one of the soldiers from Hadley, John Montague, and this is his muster roll for Lexington. He was one of the soldiers or a militia from Hadley who went to respond to the British, to the event in Lexington and Concord. Now, they didn't get there in time, obviously. They didn't hear about it until it was over, but they went anyway. And he was credited with servicing. And see, he only served like 3 or 4 days service. Okay. Go back. Yeah. This is Lexington and Concord, the fight at Lexington and Concord, the first, the blood shed. And when that alarm came out to Hadley, 46 men from Hadley marched to Boston in response. And some of them stayed. Some of them came home right afterwards. Quite a few of them stayed in Boston. Most of the men from Hadley who served in the early years of the war when things were happening in New England and New York. And after the war moved down south, there wasn't so much service. They still have to serve, but they didn't go to quite so many places. A few of them did. And on this plaque, go back to the plaque, this is the plaque. There's 174 names on that plaque, okay? Although we know that more served, at least 185 served. Not all the names got on there. Now, and there's a reason why. But in this list of names, many of them were from the founding families of Hadley. This list includes 5 Dickinsons, 20 Cooks, 5 Kellogg's, 6 Marshes, 3 Montagues, 8 Whites, and 15 Smiths. And some of the notable veterans who served from Hadley, I'll just go through the list. Benjamin Colt, who was the grandfather of Samuel Colt, who invented the Colt revolver. Levi Dickinson, he later became the first broom manufacturer in the country. Stephen Goodman, he was the ferryman at the other end of the south end of the Common. And he married into the Kellogg family, who owned and operated that ferry for over 120 years at the south end of West Street. Elijah Porter, we'll talk more about him. He served in the Provincial Congress and the Sheriff of Hampshire County. He was a courier for General Washington and Benedict Arnold. He commanded a regiment at Bunker Hill. And he went to Canada, and he was at Saratoga. And he also served after the Revolution during Shays' Rebellion. He served with the militia who put down Shays' Rebellion. And so he was a sheriff for many, many, many years. He lived in, well, we'll talk about where he lived a little bit later on. Captain Eliakim Smith, he initially commanded the 46 men from Hadley, the militia who went to Boston after Lexington and Concord. Unfortunately, he was the first one to die, not in combat, but of disease in Watertown, where he's buried. He has a marker in Old Hadley Cemetery, but he's not buried there. And he was succeeded by Moses Kellogg. Francis Newton served as well. With his wife Elizabeth, he ran the ferry at the north end, the house that we looked at before. That's where he lived. The Pierce brothers, William and David, Josiah's sons, 2 of his sons, served on the march to Quebec, led by Benedict Arnold. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But David died in Quebec of fever, and his brother kept a journal, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Elijah Cook had 4 sons who served: Coleman, William, Perez, and Waitstill. They all served in the Revolution. And there's also on this list, there's a gentleman by the name of Joseph Mamenash. He was not a Hadley founder. He was a Native American, served in the Revolution from Northampton. His family was from Northampton. His sister was Sally Mamenash, who was quite well known. If you read a historic Deerfield, there's a whole story about the Mamenash family, especially Sally. But Joseph, her brother, served from Hadley for 3 years. There's some dispute about, or some uncertainty about where he's buried. He supposedly died during the war in 1781, but there's also a story that he's buried with his sister and his father in Northampton, in what is now known as Hospital Hill, the foot of the former state hospital. And they had tombstones, which had since been vandalized and removed and no longer there. But it is known where they were buried, in Northampton. And then there were black men from Hadley who served. Not all their names are on this plaque, but 3 of them are. The black men who served in the Revolution included Joshua Boston, Levi Pruitt, Caesar Phelps, Amos Hull, Ichabod Nye, Ralph Way, and Caesar Freeman. There are no tombstones marking their graves. They are probably buried in Old Hadley. But the 3 of them, Joshua Boston, Levi Pruitt, and Ichabod Nye, their names are on the plaque in Hadley. And then there was one other gentleman who should be mentioned, John Morrison. He was a Scottish Highlander who served with the British. So he fought, he was on the other side. When his ship came into Boston Harbor with the 77th Highlanders to fight against the Americans, they were captured immediately because Boston had just fallen. He was captured, became a prisoner of war before he even set foot on the continent. He ended up at Port of Phelps. He was sent there to work, and he lived the rest of his life at the Port of Phelps house. He was their gardener, and he designed and took care of the gardens at the Port of Phelps. And he does have a stone. He was buried at Old Hadley, and there is a stone for him as a Highlander. I always debate about when we put the flags out for the veterans of all the wars every Memorial Day, whether I should be putting a British flag next to his stone. Of course, he would probably say, well, if there's a Scottish flag, it would be better. So moving ahead, Bunker Hill was the next big battle in the Revolution that Hadley participated in. And this was a loss for the Americans. They were forced to withdraw, but it was a psychological victory because the Americans lost about 400 men compared to the British, who lost over 1,000. And the British realized they were in for a fight. And they never left Boston after that. They just were cooped up in Boston, and the revolutionary soldiers who responded to Lexington and Concord ended up surrounding Boston and conducting the siege of Boston until the British evacuated. So the Pierce, this is the beginning of the battle. Joshua Pierce, the town clerk, his diary has an entry saying, "Fight at Charlestown began last Saturday on the 17th, and Charlestown burnt. The guns fired in this fight were heard at the foot of the Holyoke Mountain, 120 miles as the road goes." That's amazing that you could hear the cannon noise from Bunker Hill in Hadley, at least according to him. I have no reason to doubt it, but. And then later he said, his diary, 6/24/1775, "I received the news David was wounded in Charlestown. 'Tis said slightly." So his sons were at Bunker Hill. This is another painting of the Battle of Bunker Hill. This shows the death of General Warren, who was one of the leaders of the revolution from Boston. So after the siege of Boston, or actually during the siege of Boston, it was decided to invade Canada and see if we could take Canada from the British, because that was one of their main places where they were supplying their troops. It wasn't just ships coming from Britain. Obviously Canada was a British colony, and they had a lot of presence there, and they were historically a pain in the neck to the colonies anyway from there. Even before the British, the French were. When the French had Canada, there was always disputes and battles. This is, Benedict Arnold convinced George Washington to invade Canada, and Benedict Arnold led the march to Quebec, which we'll talk about in a bit. But this is this article, Diary of a Revolutionary Soldier. William Pierce, who went to Quebec, who served, Josiah's son, who served in many battles, kept a diary during the war. And he didn't sign the diary. It was anonymous. He just kept it. The diary ended up in the 1880s in the State of Washington Historical Society. And it's a long story about how it got there. I won't go into that, but that's where it resided. There was an article in the Tacoma Times about this diary of Revolutionary War, and it has excerpts and from his experiences in Quebec and in other locations. This diary was transcribed in a very obscure journal called the Antiquarian Journal in 1900. It was transcribed, but they still didn't know who wrote it. No idea where this came from. It was anonymous, the anonymous diary. In 2022, someone who was doing research, Stephen Darley, I believe his name was, doing research on Quebec, on the March to Quebec, the Benedict Arnold's March. And there were a number of people who kept diaries. And he ran across this diary and read the transcription and said, I've got to figure out who this guy is. And he did figure out who it was. It was William Pierce. He was able to put together because of hints, and mainly because in the diary, if I get the quote, in the diary, 28th December, about 2 o'clock, my brother died after 30 days illness with fever and flux, his brother David. And the researchers were able to piece together all the information in there and figure out that it was, yes, William and David Pierce. And when they looked at the Revolutionary War records, yep, they went to Quebec. And so they identified William Pierce as the writer of the diary. When I found out that it was at the Historical Society in Washington, so this diary was lost for 120 years, okay? It's still lost, folks. I called up the Washington Historical Society saying, hey, do you still have this diary? They looked for months. They couldn't find it. They found this article. They found other stuff. They're still looking. But fortunately, we have the transcription of the diary that was in that journal. So we have the information, which is pretty cool. Let me talk about, so this is Benedict Arnold, the famous Benedict Arnold, who was actually one of the best generals that the Revolutionary War had, okay? He obviously changed sides. And there's a lot you could talk about, whether he got a bum rap or not. He certainly did not get treated well. He certainly did not get the recognition that he deserved for his exploits. And that's why he went the other way. But he was a darn good general, especially in the activities that happened in the northern part of New England. This is him in 1775. This is the route of the march to Quebec from Boston. The troops went by boat to Maine, I think it was Kennebec River, and then they marched overland through Maine. I don't know why they did that. They should have gone the other way, up through Lake Champlain, okay? A lot easier. But I guess Benedict Arnold thought he was going to surprise them. Yeah, well, he surprised himself, because that march was hell on wheels, hell on earth. 1,500 men marched through the wilderness of Maine. They've had about as many roads then as they do now, which is nothing. Through the wilderness, 2 months, and 300 miles. Took them 2 months to go 300 miles. Half of them made it. And they went through hell. They had to fight the weather, the bugs, lack of food. They had these boats, flat-bottom boats called bateaux, to carry their supplies and men and to go when they were able to get into some water. But first of all, they were going against the current most of the time. And there were falls and white water, and they had to portage around, so as much as 12 miles, carrying these things through the woods. And it was rough. When they got to, when they finally made it, here's an entry from Pierce's journal. arriving at St. Lawrence River below Quebec on December 1st. Our army, who came almost naked to this cold country, some of us lost our clothes in the rivers, some wore them out, and some were so weak by reason of hunger. So they did link up with General Montgomery, who had taken Montreal, and they got resupplied, and then they were able to launch an attack against Quebec. So this is them. This is the Americans marching through the wilderness in Quebec. You can see the howling winds. I think there was a hurricane that may have hit them. The weather was freezing. This is them with the boats portaging around the falls. Nice work if you can get it. And this is the Battle of Quebec, when they finally got to the walls of Quebec and made an attempt to take the city, when they were repulsed quite easily. And this is General Montgomery was killed during that battle, one of the American generals. Benedict Arnold was wounded. And then, as I said, they retreated back to Montreal. This is Josiah Pierce. We heard that David died and died there. Let's see if I can get. In Josiah Pierce, this is Josiah Pierce's journal from 1776, January. Received the sorrowful news of son's David's death by sickness at Pointe de Trumbull, Canada. On the 9th, news confirmed by letter from William. So after the Battle of Quebec, the Americans didn't quite give up on the idea of doing something up there, so they wanted to send some reinforcements. So General Washington wrote a letter to Elijah Porter of Hadley, and this is the actual letter he wrote. And let me just get the last page, and you can read. If you can't quite see this, but it says, G.W. signed it for Colonel Elijah Porter, and it's instructions to Porter to assemble some men and get up to Canada and help reinforce Benedict Arnold, which is what Elijah did. Of course, he marched the other way, the smart way, and got up there just in time to help them retreat back down the valley. And this is the letter from Benedict Arnold to Elijah Porter when Elijah got up to Canada with his troops. He got an order from Benedict Arnold saying, get up to Quebec with the provisions, medicine, and your men as fast as you can. That's the letter to Porter from Benedict Arnold. These letters are up at Historic Deerfield. They were donated by the family not too long ago. All right, so let me talk about our friend Elisha Porter. This is the Porter house, built by Samuel Porter on West Street, the oldest house in town. This is where Elijah Porter, his grandson, was born and lived his early years. This is not Elijah Porter. We're hoping it might be Elijah Porter. This is his brother Eliezer, his older brother, who lived in the same house. He was a true river god. He was the richest man in Hadley for a long time. Elijah was rich, but not so rich. Elijah was a soldier and a sheriff. Eliezer was a merchant and a rich one. So this was painted by a painter named William Jennis, who's an itinerant painter, and this was painted around 1760. So I'm assuming that Elijah looked something like his brother, and that's hanging at the historical house here in town. This is a silhouette of the Porter family that was done maybe a little later. It's probably not either Eliezer or Elijah, but it's in the family. It was probably one of their sons. This is Benjamin Lincoln, who was related to the Huntingtons, the Porter Phelps Huntington. He was a general during the Revolution. He also led the militia later on after the war against the Shays' Rebellion. And his tea set is up at the border of Phelps-Huntington. So he was here, okay? And I just have his picture because Elijah Porter probably looks something like this in uniform, okay? That's the uniform he probably would have had. And we think so because that is Elijah Porter's uniform, part of it. That's his waistcoat from his uniform. That's up at Historic Deerfield, donated to fairly recently. And also, his epaulettes from his uniform are also at Historic Deerfield. So he was probably decked out pretty, fancy, unlike the soldiers. Now, this is General Burgoyne, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, quite the character. His main, other than losing the Battle of Saratoga, his main claim to fame was that he wrote plays when he went back to Britain, and he was quite the ladies' man, and you can see he was quite a dandy. See that sword he's holding there? We'll talk about that a little bit later on, but take a note of what it looks like. So Burgoyne was in charge of the British troops up in Canada, and their strategy was to come down through the Lake Champlain, to divide New England from New York and defeat the Revolutionary Army in detail. Of course, it never happened because he screwed up, and his General Howe, his helper, never came to meet up with him, so he was stranded up there with his soldiers. They were eventually surrounded by the Americans and defeated at Saratoga in late September 1777. This is him. This is a famous painting by Trumbull of the surrender of General Burgoyne at Saratoga. You see he's giving his sword to General Gates. And the story is that Gates gave him back the sword, which is what they always did, because they were all aristocrats, So he kept the sword. William Pierce was at Saratoga and saw this, according to his diary. Now, this sword, let's talk about the sword. For many, many years, starting in about 1896, on through the 250th anniversary of the town of Hadley. They had a very big celebration in 1909, the 250th. And that celebration, we had 10,000 people come to town. And a lot of the old families came back. And a lot of relics and artifacts from the families were shown and displayed at the library and at Town Hall, including a sword. And the story, which has been repeated time and time again through every historical book that you read about Hadley, is that General Burgoyne, after the surrender of Saratoga, his army, the Convention Army they called it, of defeated soldiers were marched to Boston, and they came through Hadley. They stayed, and Burgoyne and some of his officers stayed at Elijah Porter's house, were treated well, and in gratitude, he left his sword with the Porter family. And the sword, there is a sword in the Porter family. There has been a sword. This is a picture of it, okay, from 1909. That's a 1909 picture of the sword. Doesn't that look familiar? It's definitely a British sword. And this is 1959. The sword was still in Hadley. Or a sword was we'll call it the sword, okay? And the story has changed a little bit because clearly what happened was the Porter family got a sword. And it was passed down through 3 or 4 generations. And the story got twisted or changed or embellished a little bit each time. If we go back to the first one, Captain Smith. Well, there's no Captain Smith. There is an S.D. Smith, who was Porter's grandson, who lived in the house that Burgoyne stayed at. So whoever wrote this article confused Samuel D. Smith, Porter's grandson, with Porter, because he wouldn't have and there was no Captain Smith. So the sword was displayed at various times and is well documented in Hadley from 1909 up to 1959, and then disappeared. And it has been called into question by researchers about whether Burgoyne ever stayed here. We don't think Burgoyne did stay here because it is also well documented that he went by a different route to Boston. Okay? However, his soldiers did come through Hadley. That's also well documented. And the most likely scenario is that one of the officers leading the British soldiers, one of the British officers, did stay at Porter's house and left his sword. And there's good evidence that this was a common practice, because the Convention Army defeated British soldiers. They were, rocks were thrown at them. They were not treated well on the route, and it was hard. And but the officers had this little ploy where they could get better treatment. They would pretend to be Burgoyne, the aristocratic Burgoyne. Oh, well, because Burgoyne was treated, the actual Burgoyne was treated very well when he stayed in Albany at General Schuyler's house. He was treated like one of the family. He was given the best room in the house. He met the Schuyler daughters, one of whom ended up marrying Hamilton. And he was an aristocrat. They were aristocrats. Yeah, we're having this little dispute about the Revolution, but, we're the same type. So it's not... It's very believable that if you were a British officer and you pretended to be not just a British officer, but General Burgoyne, you're going to get some royal treatment from these hicks who didn't know any better. And that's, I think, what happened. It's not clear if Porter even was in Hadley, himself was in Hadley at the time. He did come back. He was sick during most of '77. He did come back and forth. And we know that there was a time in October when Elizabeth Porter Phelps visited him. But there's no mention in any of these diaries about Burgoyne staying in Hadley. There's talk about the news from Saratoga. There's news, Elizabeth Porter Phelps talks about when the soldiers were marched through Hadley. They went to see them on the Common, big crowd in the Common to see this, and joyful news, wonderful news, what a great thing. Nothing about Burgoyne, okay? Nothing in Pierce's diary about Burgoyne coming through Hadley. So we're pretty sure he never came to. In fact, I think we have, what they did leave was the tent poles, okay? The tent poles from the soldiers who camped on the Common during late October. Some of them camped near the ferry in a very small portion of what was then the Aquavita Meadow. Others on the Common, and these were the tent poles of their tents, which was left here. We have them at the Historical Society. Don't have the sword, but we have the tent poles. This is the other Porter house on West Street that S.D. Smith lived in, okay? And this is not the house, house did not exist in 1777, except for the back part of it. This was replaced in the 1850s by Smith, Porter's grandson. But this is, I believe this is it's 30 West Street. So that house, you can see that house today. It's on West Street. But it's not, and it's the site of where Elijah Porter would have lived when he moved out of the Eliezer's house. And this is the only remaining portion of Captain Smith, it means S.D. Smith's house, where Burgoyne spent the night on his way to Boston after the surrender. This is from one of the Hadley souvenir programs from the 1909. That little arched, I think it was a pump house or something like that, that was still there I don't think it's there anymore, but it was there until fairly recently. That was part of Porter's house, where Burgoyne supposedly stayed. And this is Sherman Lone's blog. Sorry, Hadley, he never left behind his sword. And I think we've established that. But he did leave, somebody left a sword. So what happened to the sword? Okay. In 1967, let me just see if I can get the chronology here. So Samuel Porter's great-grandson was named Smith. He had a sister named Pamela. She married a coolie from Hartford and moved to Hartford. Okay? Pamela and S.D. Smith both died the same year, 1910, right after the 1909 celebration. They had the sword. One of them had the sword. We think Smith died, S.D. died first. He was unmarried. He had no children. His sister, who was married, took the sword to Hartford with her. Or her daughter did. She died in 1910. Her daughter got it in Hartford. And then the great-great-grandson of S.D. Smith, whose name is Brown, Cooley Brown, Francis Cooley Brown, had the sword. When he was wrapping up his affairs in the 60s, they donated the sword, this is the same sword, to West Point, not the Hadley Historical Society. Well, I can't blame them. But this sword is now at West Point, okay? And that's the same. You just look at what it looks like. It's not a very great picture. This is from an article that was done by park rangers up in Saratoga. I went to West Point last year to get a good look at it. The museum's closed. Everything's in storage. One day I will go out there and put my eyeballs on that thing and maybe bring it back to what's that?
It's back out.
Oh, it is. Oh, did you? Okay. But even then, this thing, they would not. This would not be on display. They'd have to make a special, and so it's probably back in the storage bins somewhere. But anyway, that's what happened to quote unquote Burgoyne's sword. I will say, we do know where Hooker's sword is. Different war. Recently did find out where that is. It's not in Hadley, but it's in Northampton. General Hooker. Maybe we can get that back too sometime. So this is Elijah Porter's grave. We'll talk a little bit about the men who were buried in Hadley. Elijah Porter's gravestone. He passed away in 1796. Oh, this other sword, that's the sword that's on display there. This is a Revolutionary War sword given to the Historical Society by one of the Lymans. We don't know if he actually carried it, if a Lyman carried it, because it was given by one of his descendants. But this was probably carried by a Hadley soldier during the Revolution. And it's not an American sword, it's a French sword, French grenadier sword. And according to Richard Colton, who's looked at these things, he's pretty sure that this sword was captured when the Americans, this is way before the Revolution, in 54, when the Americans, not the Americans, the British colonists decided they had enough of the French interrupting our shipping, and from their big fortress up in Louisbourg, which is up in Nova Scotia, or was. So they mounted an expedition. Several Hadley guys were on this. One of them died up there. They took the fortress in 1754. They captured a lot of the French arms and brought them back. And this is probably from Louisbourg in Canada. It's made by the French. And it's kind of similar. It has the similar hilt and as the other swords of the Revolution. So let me say, John Smith, he was a major and we don't have that many pictures of Hadley soldiers. This is one of them, not a photograph, obviously, but a drawing. John Smith. The other one was that Yeah, this is the, we know this is a Hadley guy. John Smith. In probably 1820, he decided to apply for his pension. This is like 50 years after the Revolution. And he never got, see if I can, so that's the actual petition for his pension. And you can't really read it, but this is a transcription, which is interesting. I, John Smith of Hadley, in the county of Hampshire and Commonwealth of Massachusetts, being over 65 years of age, do testify and say that in the month of April 1775, I enlisted in Captain Eliakim Smith's company in Colonel Ward's regiment, continued in the service near Boston during that campaign. In the winter of 1776, I again enlisted in Colonel Elijah Porter's regiment, marched to Quebec in Canada, continued in the service until January 1777, was commissioned as a second lieutenant. In the same year, I served at the capture of Burgoyne, and thus continued in the service of the Revolutionary War against the common enemy. In March 1781, I was detached and served under the Marquis de Lafayette as a lieutenant. So he must have been at Yorktown. On my march southward in the state of Maryland, while in the United States service, I was attacked and had brought upon me a rupture of alarming appearance, whatever that is, which has continued to the present time, disenabling me from labor. I have never received a pension from the United States. I have always thought that I was justly entitled to one in consequence of the injuries aforesaid. I am in reduced circumstances and stand in need of assistance from my country for support. This was not uncommon. A lot of the soldiers never got paid anything or very little, and they were entitled to a pension or land, and they had to fight for it. Interestingly, William Pierce, who was still alive in 1820 and in Hadley, testified in testified that yes, he did serve in the Revolution. This is John Smith. I don't know whether he ever got his pension. I don't know. This is his grave in Old Hadley, the tall one. That's John Smith's grave marker. This is Eliakim Smith's grave marker in Old Hadley. Now, I mentioned before, he didn't die in Hadley. He died in Watertown. He's buried in Watertown. This is a cenotaph. There's a marker, but they call it a cenotaph. That's just a marker for someone who died. It's memorializing someone who died elsewhere, is buried elsewhere, but is from this area. So he has a cenotaph. This is William Montague. We do have a portrait. This is another one of the few that we actually know what they look like. Well, this is him in his older days. He was actually from Sunderland. His family's from Hadley. He served from Hadley in the Revolution as a young man. And he ended up moving to Hadley after the Revolution and dying here. And he was very wealthy. Only wealthy people had their pictures painted, okay? He's buried in Russellville. The only Revolutionary War veteran was buried not in Old Hadley or North Hadley or Hockanum, in Russellville. And why? Because he's from Sunderland, and Russellville Cemetery is close to Sunderland. I think that's why. This is John Montague, one of the early people who went to Lexington and Concord. His grave. His brother David, who also died during the Revolution at West Point. And that is the marker says, David Montague, their son, who died near West Point in the service of his country, 1781, age 26. So there were two Davids. There were two sets of brothers, the Pierce brothers, William and David, and the Montague brothers, Josiah and David, who served in the Revolution. Both Davids, the younger brothers, died of disease. Nobody got, as far as we know, there were 5 or 6 Hadley men who died during the war. None of them were killed. They all died of disease, which was pretty much true of the rest of the army, too. That's where the biggest problem. It's actually true in the Civil War as well. Typhoid, dysentery, smallpox. This is what cut down a number of the soldiers. That's Benjamin Colt's gravestone in Old Hadley. That's Levi Dickinson's. You see how they spelt his name wrong. Dickens. And this is the record of deaths in the town of Hadley for 1831 and 32. And on that is this entry. William Pierce, one of Arnold's soldiers, through the woods to Quebec. That's in the actual death record in the town of Hadley. So he died in 1832. David Stockbridge, he died the same year. This is William Pierce's grave in Old Hadley. You see, most of these have the daughters of the Sons of American Revolution markers, which were put in. Most of the Revolutionary War veterans have them, not all of them, but most of them do have them. They were put in the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 30s. This is the front of Goodwin, okay? When they did the memorial in 1920, and you can barely read it. It says, Soldiers Memorial, 1776, 1861, and 1917. And upstairs, if you go upstairs, if you ever get a chance to go upstairs and look at those murals, which we hope we will be someday when they fix the building up and put an elevator in and kick Hadley Media out of the top floor. This is what it says up there, in addition to the plaques. Hadley in the 3 wars, the brave live on. And that's the end of my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. Any questions? We're all going, yeah, go ahead, sir.
What was the relationship of Stephen Goodman to Deacon Richard Goodman?
That, I would have to research that. But they were all related. And back then, everybody, even like Hadley now, everybody's related, okay? But back then, they had large families and they intermarried. Afterwards, if you give me the dates and the name, I can tell you what the relationship is. It's not hard to find, but I'm betting that they were related closely. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
I may have misheard, but you were talking about the black soldiers,
Mm-hmm.
and one of them had the last name Phelps.
Yeah, yes.
Was that a free?
No, Caesar Phelps, that's a good story. If any of you have not been to the Port of Phelps, go there, okay? They have their own exhibit on the American Revolution, and it focuses mostly on the enslaved who lived and died or escaped from there. And Caesar Phelps is probably the most well-known. He was Charles Phelps' slave. Charles Phelps, when he went to Boston, 1775, I think it was, 76, went to Boston. He was always going to Boston to provision the troops. You might say he wasn't a war profiteer because he was doing this even before, but he made money supplying the troops with food. And he brought his slave, Caesar, with him and left him there because Caesar served in the revolution in place of Charles as a substitute. Caesar ended up in Ticonderoga or Crown Point, and he wrote a letter back saying, hey, I hate it here. I don't want to stay with this guy because, when the blacks served, not many of them got to fight. Most of them were servants, just like they were here. But at least they had a chance. There was a chance that they could get freed. None of them got freed. Or just somehow get some kind of benefit from serving. We talk about the Declaration of Independence, well, all men are created equal. That really means in this country, all white men, not women, not blacks, not Indians, not anything, they're created equal, okay? And that's, you think to yourself, well, wait a second, they were fighting for freedom and independence and Declaration of Independence, but, they didn't free their slaves. We didn't free them. The Southerners didn't free them. A few did. I shouldn't say that. Some did, but not many. And some of them were able to get their freedom by hook or by crook, buying their freedom, negotiating something. So they definitely saw a benefit, some of them. I don't think they were forced to fight. And one of them, Joshua Boston, who did fight, he became a well-known, well-respected man in Hadley who owned property, who employed whites to work for him, okay? And his house was on the end of, right north, where North Lane and Middle Street come together, right near the dike. That's where he had a house. He was very well respected in town. I don't know why he doesn't have a tombstone, because it's the whole story about when he was buried that people were tearing their clothes. Oh, and he was such a great guy and so noble. But anyway, and his name is on the plaque at least. And he was freed. It was not because of the revolution. He was freed because, eventually all the slavery was outlawed or came to an end. It wasn't actually outlawed. It came to an end in Massachusetts. So but anyway, Porterfels has a terrific exhibit if you want to learn about black and indentured and the indigenous people and their experiences up at Porterfels and before, during, and after the revolution. It's a great exhibit. Anybody else? Well, thanks for your patience with the slideshow. And we'll look forward to seeing you next year when we do one on the Declaration.